Welcome again to our new and former book club members. I trust you all have the questions in front of you for this lecture and this part of the story, and also what I hope is your annotated copy of the story, meaning that I hope on Friday you put a lot of notes on the story, and that's always helpful for you. Now, in your mailboxes was also your assignment for the day of our small group follow-up discussions. Some of you are coming tomorrow, Wednesday, and some of you are coming on the following Friday. And this lecture will be repeated tomorrow at 12 o'clock. In your mailboxes was your assignment for the day of the small group follow-up discussions. Be sure to bring your questions and answers to both parts of the story, plus your copy of the story for you to use when we discuss it, when we argue, when we go about what we love doing. And as this lecture will be aired tomorrow as well. Let me turn then to part 2 of Willa Cather's Paul's Case. And the subject of today's lecture is the themes of the story. Paul's Case is a story about a young man who loves art and beautiful things, so much that he steals money and goes to New York to live a life of opulence and grandeur. When his crime is discovered, Paul commits suicide rather than return to the dreary, middle-class life he escaped in Pittsburgh. The story's major themes revolve around questions about Paul's character. Now, I'm going to read you these questions. I want you to think about them because we may try to answer them at the end of this lecture today, or better yet, we'll probably answer them in our small group discussions. So, first question. Was Paul driven to his fate by the destructive values of America? Or is he morally corrupt and responsible for his own actions? Number 2, is Paul, as his teachers, father, and friends agree, a, quote, bad case, an abnormal personality? Or do the others have an overly narrow view of what is normal? And number 3, do the worlds of business and industry, represented by Cordelia Street, destroy an appreciation of culture and aesthetics? Or does Paul choose to live in a world of illusion that destroys his grip on reality? These are tough questions, and we will work on answering them certainly in our small groups. Now, the first theme that I want to mention is the American dream. And the American dream is really an underlying theme of this story. Paul's father and the rest of Cordelia Street, a, quote, perfectly respectable middle-class neighborhood, believe in values of hard work, family, and church. During their leisure time, they sit around swapping stories about their bosses, the so-called captains of industry, the robber barons I talked about last Friday, who work themselves up from poverty to lead large corporations and live in luxury. Paul despises the monotonous lives led by Cordelia Street residents, who believe that if they work hard enough, they too might lead such a glamorous life. Now, Paul shares their same desire to become rich and lead a life without worry or without financial worry. He too likes to listen to the, quote, legends of the Iron Kings. For example, we spoke the other day about Andrew Carnegie. He disdains the cash boy job or stage that his father, when he took him out of school and took away the Carnegie Hall and the theaters and everything else, and set him up to work as a cash boy. But Paul disdains and despises this cash boy stage. Paul, to be honest, wants the triumphs of the cash boys. That is, to earn a lot of money, who became famous. Paul does manage to live a life of leisure and beauty, but not through hard work, and only for 1 week. Through lies and crime, he gains access to what he considers his real home, the New York City high life, exemplified by the Waldorf Hotel. There as he said, his surroundings explained him. In the lap of luxury, Paul realizes that, quote, this was what all the struggle was about, and that money was everything. Cather prompts us, her readers, to consider the following question. Did the American dream of wealth corrupt Paul, fostering in him a love of materialism, which ultimately leads to his ruin? Let me repeat the question. Did the American dream of wealth corrupt Paul, fostering in him a love of materialism, which ultimately leads to his ruin? What do you think? The immediate appeal of Paul's case lies in our fascination with Paul's transformation of himself, however short-lived, and his discovery, so ultimately wrong, and yet so plausible and so right, quote, as he says, that money was everything, end of quote. Here is the true accomplishment of the story, the conversion of romantic longings into a devotion to the almighty American dollar. It is a very American dream, the romance of money, and we all are used to it, aware of it. The same story was to be given greater and more developed expression a few years later after Paul's story in the transformation of James Gatz into Jay Gatsby, who also sought to invent a new self, to find new parents, to create an identity by means of drawers of shirts and opulent surroundings, all of which we read in The Great Gatsby. In fact, there may be a direct line between Paul and Gatsby. In a 1925 letter to Cather, apologizing for what might be seen as plagiarism in the likeness of the character Daisy Buchanan, Fitzgerald declares himself to Cather, quote, one of your greatest admirers. And he singles out Paul's case, along with her novels, as a favorite. So, as I said, the first theme that we are aware of is the American dream. The second theme in the story is deception. And it is through deception that Paul achieves his dream, however briefly. And Cather leaves open the possibility that his achievement is itself a form of self-deception. At home he lies to his father to cover his trips to the theater, and his tall tales at school paint the life he wants to live. In New York, although he feels at peace, freed from what he says the necessity of petty lying, he is in actuality living the biggest lie of his life. What is that lie? That lie is that he is a rich boy from Washington awaiting globe-trotting parents. So if you turn to page 16, please, all of you turn to page 16. Where did I? 1 second. Second paragraph. Beginning the second paragraph. It was a little after 1 o'clock when he drove up to the Waldorf. and after settling with the cabman, went into the office. He registered from Washington, said his mother and father had been abroad, and that he had come down to await the arrival of their steamer. He told his story plausibly and had no trouble, since he volunteered to pay for his rooms in advance. And he engaged a sleeping room, a sitting room, and a bath. He certainly put himself into a good place. He feels that, quote, as he said this time, there would be no awakening. There would be no awakening? Is he deluded that he's saying that? Or is Willa Cather foreshadowing his suicide? And if you look on page 13, the fourth line down from the top, so in the midst of that smoke-poled city, enamored of figures and grimy toil, Paul had his secret temple, his wishing carpet, his bit of blue and white Mediterranean shore, bathed in perpetual sunshine. Okay, let me find where I am. So he tells the lie, and everybody behind the desk, all the concierges, believe him. He's very adept at doing this. So we turn to the third theme, which is choices and consequences. Related to the first theme of the American dream and Paul's use of deceit to claim the American dream is a question we have to consider. It's a question of free will. Let me ask you, is Paul a sensitive adolescent who is crushed by his environment? Or is he a lying thief who refuses to take responsibility for his actions? Those are good questions. In the last line of the story on page 26, Cather writes, Paul dropped back into the immense design of things. That's the last line of the story. Look at it. And Paul dropped back into the immense design of things. What does this line suggest to you? In a way, it suggests that his death, Paul's death, was destined to happen. It was destined. But, and there's a big but now, Paul also seems to choose his fate. For example, he decides that if he were to choose again, he would do exactly the same thing. And if you look on page 23, the last paragraph, page 23, the last paragraph, he reflected drowsily to the swell of the music and the chill sweetness of his wine that he might have done it more wisely. He might have caught an outbound steamer and been well out of their clutches before now. But the other side of the world had seemed too far away and too uncertain then. He could not have waited for it. His need had been too sharp. If he had to choose over again, he would do the same thing tomorrow. He looked affectionately around about the dining room, now gilded with a soft mist. Ah, he says, it had paid indeed. So it is left to the reader to decide whether Paul really had no choice but to escape Philadelphia and his life there altogether, or whether his love for illusion and artificiality is a signal of Paul's own weakness Which one do you think it is? Did he have no choice? Or was his love for illusion and artificiality a signal of his own weakness? I want you to think about it because we'll talk about it in our follow-up groups. Okay, the fourth theme is beauty. For Paul, beauty is life, but beauty can only be found in illusions. Turn to page 12, please. The second paragraph. It was at the theater and at Carnegie Hall that Paul really lived. The rest was but a sleep and a forgetting. If you remember, I used those words in the lecture last Friday. The rest was but a sleep and a forgetting, and I told you then that that was a quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet. This was Paul's fairy tale, and it had for him all the allurement of a secret love. The moment he inhaled the gassy, painty, dusty odor behind the scenes, he breathed like a prisoner set free, and felt within him the possibility of doing or saying splendid, brilliant, poetic things. One sec, I'll be with you. Paul feels alive and comfortable in art galleries, the theater, the symphony, and the opera. Looking at paintings or listening to the opera, Paul, quote, loses himself. His identity dissolves, and he merges with his surroundings. Art is really a religion for Paul. The narrator describes the theater as his secret temple. That's on page 13. In the story, beauty can be powerful. It fascinates Paul and allows him to feel free. On the other hand, beauty can also be destructive when it makes ordinary life seem worse than jail. The fifth theme I'm going to point out is alienation. Caught up in his dreams of beauty and glamour, Paul is estranged from most of humanity. Willa Cather shows his alienation in his discomfort around the people one might expect him to be most comfortable among, his family, neighbors, and fellow students. But in the very first sequence, during the faculty hearing, Cather indicates this in her reference to how Paul shuddered away from a teacher's guiding hand. Imagine a teacher goes up and touches you, and Paul's reaction is to shudder. That's not easy to take. In addition, his own street, quote, arouses his loathing. And when the neighbors gather for a friendly chat on a Saturday afternoon, Paul sits alone on the bottom stoop, quote, staring into the street. In class, he makes much of his friends at the theater and cannot, quote, bear to have the other pupils think that he takes school at all seriously. He has only, quote, contempt for the humdrum world in which he is convinced he does not belong. Only among strangers, the glittering parade of the wealthy in New York, does he feel truly at home. And even then, he has, quote, no especial desire to meet or to know any of these people. Just strange. Turn to page 20, please. The last paragraph. He was not. He was not in the least abashed or lonely. He had no especial desire to meet or to know any of these people. All he demanded was the right to look on and conjecture, to watch the pageant. The mere stage properties or props were all he contended for, and that's what he was used to, the stage properties, the stage props. And jump down to the last sentence, please. He felt now that his surroundings explained him. What's that? Lose my place. So what does all of this tell us about Paul that we just read? Although he is among them, he is not really part of that ideal society. He fancies himself an aesthete and an individualist, but Paul alienates himself from others by exhibiting contempt for them. He believes his teachers, his fellow students, his neighbors, and his father are all provincial and unsophisticated, insufferably ordinary, insufferably mediocre. He loathes his life on Cordelia Street. And I think we read this last time in part 1, but I'm going to read it for you again, where all the houses were exactly alike, the narrator says, quote, and where businessmen of moderate means begot and reared large families of children, all of whom went to Sabbath school and learned the shorter catechism, and were interested in arithmetic, all of whom were exactly alike as their homes, and were of a piece with the monotony in which they lived. This is Paul's description of them. To demonstrate his contempt for life around him, Paul ignores his schoolwork, taunts his teachers, and pretends to the other students that he hobnobs with theater performers and that he travels the world. Then he withdraws from his humdrum life, physically and mentally, by running away to New York City with stolen money to live out his fantasies. If you remember, the 5th theme I said was alienation. How can we further explain this alienation? I will say now his self-alienation could be symptomatic of an inferiority complex. If we want to analyze this psychologically, this is another way of looking at it. Persons who suffer from the psychological